was taking a nap, but the man wasn't her real husband. As the doorknob was about to turn, the two of them were so nervous they didn't dare to breathe. Their relationship could not be exposed at any cost. To their surprise, the doorknob hesitated for a moment before loosening and turning back in the opposite direction, having narrowly escaped a crisis. The two of them finally breathed a sigh of relief. But just as Kitty had just sent Charlie away, she saw a gift from her husband left outside the door. Just when Kitty thought she had narrowly escaped, the nanny told her that the gift was left by her husband earlier. Kitty realized that things had been exposed and quickly called Charlie to discuss a plan. Before she could finish, her husband Walter called her to the living room for a conversation. Walter was a bacteriologist, and when faced with his wife's sudden betrayal, he did not expose her on the spot. Instead, he planned to punish her in the most cruel way. Walter demanded that she accompany him to China for scientific research. At that time, China was in the midst of a cholera outbreak. In 1925, going to a cholera area in China was almost equivalent to sending oneself to death. The wife believed that this was undoubtedly forcing her to a dead end, so she decisively rejected Walter's unreasonable demand. Walter stated that if she did not go to China with him, he would file for divorce, citing her infidelity as the reason. When Kitty learned the scandal had been exposed, she did not show any remorse or intend to continue hiding it. Instead, she wanted Walter to allow her to be with Charlie. Looking at his wife, Walter realized she wasn't very smart, but he never expected her to be so foolish, mistaking a fleeting passion for true love. In order to make his wife face the reality, Walter proposed that if Charlie immediately divorced his wife and married Kitty, he would divorce Kitty peacefully and no longer pursue the matter. If not, Kitty would have to go with him to China. She immediately contacted Charlie, asking him to fulfill the promise he made that night. However, she never expected that the feelings were merely a fleeting promise, now dissolved like smoke. Realizing that Charlie had been playing with her feelings, Kitty, disheartened, turned and left. All the sweet illusions shattered in that moment. She had no choice but to face reality and agree to Walter's demand. Even so, Walter was still full of anger and disappointment towards his wife's infidelity. On the way, he subjected Kitty to silent treatment. The journey that would have taken 2 days by boat, he chose to take the rugged mountain path instead. The hot environment made Kitty feel uncomfortable, and the muddy ground caused her much hardship. However, compared to the winding and steep mountain road, what frightened her more were the people along the way who had died from the plague. This made the pampered Kitty nearly unable to bear it. Kitty, who had grown up in a wealthy family, had always dreamed of a fairy tale romance. But in the end, she became an older, unmarried woman. At her father's arrangement, they met at a banquet. However, the proud Kitty wasn't interested in Walter, who lacked romance. But Walter was the complete opposite. He fell in love with Kitty at first sight and proposed to her passionately on their second meeting. But Kitty did not accept. It was not until one day when her mother said something that made her feel forced to choose. "Where do you expect your father to go? I'm supporting you." Walter was sent to Shanghai for scientific research, and the two of them moved there after marriage. Though it wasn't as luxurious as their manor in London, it was peaceful and free. But soon, she found the life boring. Walter's attention was entirely focused on his research, and he hardly communicated with Kitty. Sometimes, to keep her from getting bored, Walter would play cards with her. Over time, Kitty's heart sank into loneliness and emptiness, but at least Walter really loved her. He put down his work and took Kitty to the theater, where Kitty met the charming Charlie, a foreign play that Kitty couldn't understand. But Charlie could turn it into a love story and tell her about it, which captivated the romantic Kitty. Under Charlie's emotional pursuit, the two eventually had an affair, but Walter did not expose the affair. Instead, he took Kitty to Maytan Mansion. At first glance, Walter's decision seemed like an act of cowardice, but when Kitty learned the reason, she deeply regretted it. After 2 weeks of long travel, they finally reached their destination, but when she walked into the house, she was shocked by what she saw. The house was in disarray, the furniture broken down, and the scattered junk and the dust everywhere almost suffocated her. Even in the bedroom, there were terrifying dolls left by the previous owner. When night fell, Walter feigned kindness and reminded Kitty, if she was really scared, he could give her a cholera vaccine. Kitty angrily said she wouldn't take the vaccine, and Walter replied that neither would he. In this silent marital conflict, both chose to vent their emotions without a word. The next morning, Kitty walked out of the room and saw Walter talking to a local officer. To ensure Kitty's safety, the officer sent a soldier to protect her. However, said that he wasn't that kind-hearted. It was the adjutant's idea. Then Walter set off with the officer to search for the source of the cholera. On the way, They were drawn to a well where locals were fetching water. Based on his past experience with bacterial research, Walter concluded that the well water might be contaminated. They then went to a choleric treatment clinic, filled with the stench of pain and despair. Countless villagers struggled in agony from their suffering, and though Walter had mentally prepared for it, seeing the villagers tortured by the virus still stirred up an indescribable turmoil inside him. The harsh environment and the constant risk of contracting cholera almost suffocated Kitty. She couldn't help but think of Charlie again, imagining that he could save her from her desperate predicament. While Walter went to the village for research, Kitty wrote a letter to Charlie, asking the local officer to send it for her. When the officer saw the recipient's name, he was curious about how Kitty knew Charlie, as he had crossed paths with him due to work. He mentioned that Charlie had many lovers outside, and what was even more shocking was that his wife never cared and publicly claimed that Charlie was only interested in second-rate women. The officer's harsh words hit Kitty where it hurt the most. Filled with resentment, she fled, tearing up the letter full of love and the fantasy she had about Charlie. Only after regaining her composure did she realize that she had been nothing more than a fleeting affair to Charlie, and the only person she could rely on now was her husband. But Walter remained cold, choosing to read instead of speaking a single word. Kitty was the thorn in his heart, stabbing into the softest part of him, leaving him wounded and bleeding. Though they were under the same roof, the air between them was thick with silence, as if an invisible barrier separated them. Kitty had had enough of this way of living. In protest, she began eating uncooked food. But Walter, in a childish act of rebellion, ate with her. This emotional Cold War suffocated Kitty, and with no hope left for life, she longed to escape this death-filled place. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw the villagers who had died from cholera. She couldn't help but want to touch them, as if doing so would end her own suffering. Thankfully, the officer appeared just in time to stop her, while Walter, equally tormented, turned to alcohol for solace. Drunk, Walter found his wife. It was during this time that he truly showed his concern for her, perhaps deep down still loving her but unable to express it while sober. The next morning, Kitty, accompanied by the officer, went to the only monastery in the village. The green hills and clear waters temporarily lifted her spirits. However, as she stepped into the village, the sight of destruction and despair made her uneasy. There was no bustling city atmosphere here, just countless homeless children and angry youths who despised foreigners. Once inside the monastery, she felt the unique peace and tranquility that it offered. The abbey's head told Kitty that Dr. Walter was a man of great love. Not only did he rush to the front lines, but he also cared deeply for the children at the orphanage. Everyone in the village respected him. At that moment, Kitty truly saw her husband for the first time. The quiet, reserved man had warmth and kindness behind his silence. What Walter did was not just great, it symbolized a spirit of selfless dedication. In that moment, Kitty realized how foolish her past actions had been. Looking back on the chaos and superficiality of her life, she felt her life had no real value. That night, Kitty's emotions were overwhelming. She felt she needed to reassess this man who was both familiar and strange to her. She brought dinner and a lamp to Walter's study but found him already asleep at the desk. Hearing the noise, Walter awoke, but despite Kitty's thoughtful care, he still did not offer the warmth she had hoped for. Recalling past memories, Walter still refused to communicate, punishing her silence with his own. Kitty, however, was unwilling to give up. She knew her faults and the deep wound she had caused her husband, but she still couldn't help but speak from the heart. Kitty was left speechless and retreated to her room, silently sobbing. Walter wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't overcome the shadow in his heart. At that moment, it felt as if the sky was crying for them. After a night of rain, Kitty realized she shouldn't just give up. She returned to the monastery, telling the abbey head she wanted to stay. The abbey head, reluctant to let her handle the many tasks, still watched Kitty with unwavering determination to stay. Kitty went to the nursery and began changing the baby's diapers, but the language barrier left her flustered, unsure of what to do. Despite the confusion, she was determined to overcome these challenges and contribute what little she could. While fetching water outside, she unexpectedly ran into Walter. He had intended to criticize her decision to stay at the monastery, but watching her leave, he understood that it was not an impulsive decision. Kitty's presence had added a new color to the monastery, with children surrounding her, listening to her play melodies. This made her realize the true meaning of compassion, responsibility, and care. Walter, passing by, unconsciously stopped to listen. Hearing the music she was playing, it was as if the veil between them was slowly lifting. The sweet memories of their first meeting seemed to resurface in his mind. Time and busyness healed everything. There was no longer Cold War or distance between them, just a quiet smile, acceptance, and the fading of past misunderstandings. When Kitty self-deprecatingly spoke of the past, Walter smiled in understanding. They had always been focused on each other's flaws, ignoring the hidden sparks of goodness beneath. Only when the veil was lifted did they truly see each other's hearts, and they discovered the real truth of their love. Soon, Walter discovered the source of the cholera. It turned out that the villagers had buried their deceased relatives by the river, believing it to be a feng shui paradise. However, this had contaminated the town's water supply. When he suggested relocating the bodies to prevent the plague from spreading, the villagers strongly opposed it. To them, this sacred land by the water could not be disturbed, no matter the cost. Despite the resistance, Walter, along with the local officers, forcibly moved the infected bodies and sealed off the downstream water supply. Although the plague was under control, the villagers' customs clashed with his actions, and due to the ongoing war, the villagers turned their anger toward Kitty as she was returning home. They rushed to Kitty and without hesitation, pushed her to the ground. Kitty struggled to escape but was eventually cornered. Even Walter, who arrived in time, couldn't stop the angry villagers. It wasn't until a gunshot rang out that they managed to escape the predicament, and in doing so, they let go of their last grudges. As love suddenly blossomed, the two of them wholeheartedly accepted each other once again. In the days that followed, whenever Kitty had time, she would quietly watch her husband at his workplace. When Walter wasn't busy, he would accompany her on boat rides, and all the unspoken hatred between them was washed away by happiness, leaving only their deep, lasting love. Walter also helped the villagers solve their water supply issues. Using the principle of windmills, he redirected the water from an upstream lake into the villagers' homes. However, these peaceful days didn't last long. One day, while dancing, Kitty suddenly vomited and collapsed. When she woke from her fainting spell, she feared she had contracted cholera, but the doctor, with a smile on his face, gave her a much more complicated piece of news: she was pregnant. Faced with the news of a new life, Kitty didn't feel joy. Instead, she was filled with confusion. Walter rushed over and found her in a daze. Their relationship had only just begun to improve, and now this confusing issue had arisen. Walter asked if he was the father of the child, but Kitty didn't know the answer. Walter, however, believed the question no longer mattered. What mattered now was that they were truly in love with each other. Faced with Walter's caring concern, she could only cry and apologize, while Walter gently comforted her. From the moment he chose to forgive Kitty, he had already made peace with their past. But, just as the cholera outbreak had been brought under control, another village began to suffer a new wave of infections. For Kitty's safety, Walter had her stay at a nearby convent. One morning, he came to the convent, kissed her lovingly, and then went to the cholera front lines to prevent the disease from spreading. Walter arranged for soldiers to set up a quarantine zone outside the town and bravely joined the effort himself. Days passed, and Kitty waited without hearing any news of Walter. It wasn't until that evening when an officer arrived to inform her that Walter had contracted cholera. Hearing this cruel news, her world seemed to collapse in that moment. All hope and reason shattered, and without caring for the protests, she rushed to Walter's side. Upon seeing Kitty, Walter felt a renewed hope for survival, but no matter how hard he fought, the plague within him had already taken root. Walter gazed at Kitty with deep affection and, with all his strength, expressed his only regret in this life. Until the very end, his eyes remained wide open. Kitty walked out of the hospital room in a daze. The officer tried to comfort her, but she remained silent. She watched as the dirt slowly covered her husband's body, still staring at it with calm eyes. Only when she returned to his desk and gently touched the microscope he had used, the pages of books he had turned, and the notes he had left behind, did the tears and longing flood her. Her tears couldn't stop, and her thoughts were frozen in time. He had existed in her life for just a moment, yet that moment had become an eternal memory she couldn't erase. As the cholera finally subsided, Kitty, with an endless sense of longing and remembrance for Walter, left the place. Years passed, and Kitty, now with her son, visited the flower shop where she and Walter had their first date. She carefully picked a few bouquets. As they were leaving, they unexpectedly ran into Charlie, who greeted her and her son. She smiled in response, her gaze unchanged, facing the man who once loved her. Her heart no longer fluttered with the same youthful affection. Charlie chatted with her son, and she kept smiling in return. Charlie wanted to rekindle their past romance, but Kitty gently and firmly rejected him. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.